Right. So anyway, for everyone that is here, big welcome and warm welcome to Maurice, and a big thank to be with us here in the Metaforum webinar series. I think that there is a lot of interest about your work and your new book. So thank you for accepting this invitation. We normally ask the speaker before we start if you would like to accept questions in the middle of the talk, or
yes,
if you
in the middle is fine anyway.
And anytime.
Yeah.
So if anyone has a question, will you please raise your hands, and then we'll facilitate so that you can engage with Maurice. Okay. So now we are ready. Go ahead. Yeah.
A bit of background then. Many years ago, well, originally, 1994, I came across the work of Eric Schwartz, who produced a model of third-order cybernetics, and I was highly taken by it. This comes out really of that work. After being enthused by, After being enthused by that model, I came across Maruyama's work, a cybernetician who was interested, who developed Mindscape Theory. And he considered that mindsets represented the way people think, their personalities, if you want, and they should be epistemic in nature, not anything like the trait theories that are so popular, like Myers-Briggs and so forth. That doesn't actually work, but is nicely commercialized. So I was interested in that, and I tried to develop it because one of the problems with Maruyama's work is that he had 4 mindscapes, which represented different classes, different categories of thinking processes of people. And the problem I had is that it was opaque. He said, there are more than 4. Well, how do you find the more than 4? How do you find the 5th one? He couldn't tell me. And so I got together, I presented at a conference in Vienna one year, and there I met Gerhard Fink, and he had a different set of skills from mine, and we decided to work together, and I think it's 12 or 13 years later, we linked Maruyama's work with the work of Shalom Schwartz. Now, Shalom Schwartz was interested in moving away from individualism and collectivism, because his idea was that those 2 concepts were badly understood and badly explained, and he wanted instead to get a value system that was much better than that of Habermas, for instance, not Habermas, Hofstadter. So we ended up developing this, and the outshot was we've actually got, instead of 4 mindscapes, we ended up with 16 what we call mindsets, 8 of which are cognitive and 8 of which are emotion related, affect as it's called. And so what I'm going to do is take you through, now there are about 20 slides here. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm going to let you have sight of them so that you can, you have access to these slides, I think. Or you can go to the website that this book relates to and look at the individual papers. It's a ResearchGate project that I've got. So The book came out, I thought it came out earlier, but it's only been out just a week. I thought it came out at the end of June. Now, it's a configuration approach to mindset agency theory. So the first slide is really a background. So we start off, I guess, in 1999. On the left-hand, bottom left-hand corner, in a book I wrote that really highlighted Eric Schwartz's work. And from then, I developed the idea of knowledge cybernetics, and that was a new book that was produced in 2006. And that linked with other things like Roy Frieden's extreme physical information, which is a mathematical theory. It brought in Marshall's information types. And Marshall, she was looking at the ideas of how various types of information that allow strategy to function and allow people to make decisions. That developed into social viable systems, which then developed into, and that was through a publication, another book in 2016 on autonomous agency theory. That was a paper. The book that was produced in 2016, that was a collection of papers that they're not presented as a collection of papers because I went through them very carefully and processed them so that they actually follow rather than being a disjoint collection. And that was initiated by one of my ex-students, Guo Kaijun in China, who facilitated this by allowing me to do a series of 14 lectures around the different branches of his national bank. So that was going to 14 different regions of China and linking with people in the bank and explaining the theories, etc., and seeing how it related to their perceptions and their behaviors. That resulted in mindset agency theory that was published in 2021, and that all of that accumulated together into the theory of metacybernetics, which was a term that originally von Forster presented but never used again. So it was an unused term that I thought I may as well use, and that represents higher order cybernetics. So we all know about second order cybernetics, and that's been the mainstay of cybernetics. Eric Schwartz developed a third order cybernetics, and there are various different people that looked at various different forms of third order cybernetics. And in metacybernetics, in the metacybernetics paper, that discusses even possibly higher order and whether or not they're feasible. So that was basically the background. I must keep an eye on time. So, metacybernetics. General theory of higher order cybernetics enables theory building through selection of relevant configurations of themes of interest. What it really says is that if you can find commensurable theories, you can actually find hooks that connect them, then you can bring them together. One example is the schema norms. Another is beliefs. So these are commensurable, and they have hooks that can enable you to create a theory of cognition that involves both. That's a simple example. Situations which are complex, are uncertain, unpredictable, tend to be ill-structured, have tangles of relationships, are dynamic and evolutionary, cannot be sensibly examined out of context. A living system is an autonomous agency. Now, I use agency to mean on a living system, because agencies have sub-agencies. Agencies also have agents, and some agencies come together as sub-agencies. So this is pure Simonism, if you will. Dynamic system, an entity capable of adaptation to environmental change, maintains a clear and dynamic boundary that distinguishes it from its environment, has a population of interactive autonomous agents. Interaction occurs as a complex tangle. Unexpected may emerge from the tangle. Then we have an agency framework as a general theory, broad range of phenomena, different levels of analysis, model complexity, which is dynamic, has substructure and superstructure. The substructure really defines the propositions, or the axiomatic propositions that constitute cybernetics that enable agency to operate, and the superstructure enables you to link in all of these different schemas that you can configure together. An agency internalizes their perceived externality and has a personality, if you will, that is a regulator for behavior. So here is the general third order model, originated by Eric Schwartz, but modified by me after many years. And you have an operative system, a meta system, and a meta-meta system. Now, the meta system to operative system relationship is actually an operative couple, and it's very special because the relationship is that the meta system regulates the system. Between them, there is autoporesis. There are two types of autoporesis, and I don't talk about that in the book, but in a new paper I'm just writing, you have posterior autoporesis, which goes from the meta system to the operative system, and anterior autoporesis, which goes the other way from operative system to the meta system. And if you refer to Piaget's work, autoporesis or self-production, whether you're talking about self-production that produces physical or cognitive components or regulative components of your agency, it's immaterial. But if you refer to his work and you look at von Forster's work, you will find that there's a very strong link between autoporesis and Piaget's notion of operative intelligence. And a while ago, I replaced autoporesis with the notion of operative intelligence. In Schwartz's terminology, he also introduced a second order causal agent, because autoporesis is actually in general systems theory, in a general theory, is a causal agent. There's a second order causal agent, which Schwartz called autogenesis. And that allows the meta-meta system to regulate the relationship between the meta system and the operative system. Okay, that's the basic model. Any questions anytime, please don't feel as though you should not. Here we have a very complex model. Forget the inside, where it said meta-system figurative agency. This bit in the middle is a recursion, but here we have the big loop is the same as the last diagram, and we have an environment, we have the agency system, and here we have the meta-meta system. So it's the same model, and we drop into that a recursive representation of the same model, but because it's recursive, meanings change. So here we have, instead of an operative system, we have the personality operative system, we have personality figurative system, and the cognitive system. And again, here we have operative intelligence, and we have figurative intelligence, exactly the same as in the higher order model or in the previous slide. Now, personality operative system is regulated by the personality figurative system, and the relationship between these two is regulated by the personality cognitive system. So there's a logic to it, but it starts to get complex. Believe me, I won't go higher than third order. So that should be a bit of a relief. You can have pathologies that occur in these intelligences. And in fact, there is reason to believe that you can replace general intelligence with these notions of causal agents intelligence. But that's a different discussion. So here we have, let's go back a bit. Here we have down below each of the personality traits. You have a cognitive trait, you have a figurative trait, and you have an operative trait. So this is a trait model. The personality works through traits. You have a cultural environment, which also has a cultural trait, a social environment, which has a trait. So how do you determine what these traits are? Well, if we go to Shalom Schwartz's work, we can find out. And not only Schwartz's work, there are other people's work. For instance, Sorokin produced some studies on culture, and he differentiated, this is all dyadic. Culture has one of two states, sensate or ideational. Sensate is to do with sense, ideational is to do with thinking or cognition. Down here you have at the bottom social, that is, you have patterning or dramatist, and each of those have their particular definitions. In the middle you have cognitive, figurative, and operative, and these all relate to the personality. And in these you have intellectual autonomy, and this is pure Shalom Schwartz, embeddedness, mastery plus effective autonomy or harmony, and hierarchy or egalitarianism. And these traits can actually find meeting points. So they're not they're epistemically independent, which means that you can have a bit of hierarchy and a bit of egalitarianism mixed together, or a bit of intellectual autonomy with a bit of embeddedness. So if you're looking at trying to find a measure for, say, the cognitive trait, if you take 0 and 1 as the extremes, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to find a measure which is 0.5 or something different. So I'm not going to go through that because it'll take too long, and you have the slides. You can do the same thing with, that was a cognition theory that Shalom Schwartz developed. But we, Gerhard Fink and I, then said, well, if there's a cognitive dimension, there must be an affect dimension. Because the theory in psychology says that affect influences cognition, and they interact with each other. So where is the affect, agency affect personality? So we spent a few years investigating this and came out with another agency model. And here we have exactly the same. We have the operative agency operative system, which is the structural and operational performance. In cultural, we have emotional climate. And inside, we have emotional attitude, we have motivational activation, emotional management. And these are connected by different types of intelligence, which we call emotional intelligence. And this links very nicely to theories of emotional intelligence as well. So again, I'm not going through that, but I'll show you next a set of slides that give you an impression of the meaning, how the dyadic traits work. And here they are. The first set of slides, set out slightly differently from the other. So we have agency cultural, we have emotional climate, attitude, motivational activation. And here we have for emotional climate, fear or security. For attitude, simulation or containment, motivational activation, ambition, protection, and so forth. Those affect traits. And yes, that was all. Sorry, 1, 2, yeah, that's correct. So here we have again, you can get balance in these because these are epistemically independent. So here we have a relationship between cognition and effect. And this comes from theory in the psychology literature, where people were talking about the crossfire between the operative system and the affect, really the cognitive operative system and the affect operative system. And these can only interact through the systems. They can't interact in the parts that regulate them because they don't have access to it. It's like I don't have access to the way you're thinking unless I observe your behavior, and I can impute what you're thinking by looking at your behavior. So these only interact through the systems. And there is follow through. So the cognitive trait may, in fact, influence the affective attitude, but through an indirect flow. Again, I'm not going to go through the model. We have cognition and affect mindsets. So it was Shotwell et al. That did the research that enabled us to look at the social traits. So I'm not going to go through this set of slides. I'll shoot on. Now we come to mindsets. So what mindsets do? Mindsets bring together the traits. And this is where we link with Maruyama's work. And we found using our structures, we could actually recreate Maruyama's 4 mindscapes in exactly the same way. So they were identical. But then we had the other 4 cognitive mindscapes that he never defined, plus we have the 8 affect mindscapes that he never considered. So in the brackets, you have the Maruyama's mindscapes and how they relate. This is individualist. So while Hofstede talked about individualism and collectivism, and while Shalom Schwartz was unhappy about the simplicity of the concept, here we find there are 4 types of individualism that are cognitive mindsets, and in fact, 4 types of collectivist. And collectivist mindsets start off with, they must involve certain attributes that are shown in the, I think in the next slide. And individualism must have certain attributes that are shown. Let me find out where they are. No, they're not shown there. Let me see. Okay. Here we also have the affect mindsets, and there are 2, again, types. There's stimulation and there's containment, and they're equivalent to individualism and collectivism. And again, they have their own definitions. So we can relate the affect and the and the cognition traits in the following way. So we have cognition mindsets, we have affect agency, and we have cognition agency, and we can relate. I'm not going to go through them. That's for reading. It won't make any sense if I detail them now. But what I'm actually highlighting is that there are relationships. And if you apply this theory to the real world, you can actually develop ideas about how people are behaving. And you can really anticipate how they are going to behave in the future. So again, this relates containment to collectivism. And again, I'm not going to explore that. And again, relating, there we are, same thing. And now there's a big jump. And why are we jumping? What I've explained to you is some really deep theory. But how can we use it? How can we now make measures of people? Is there any way we can assess their personality? Well, actually, there are several ways. One way is to take the 80 questionnaire. It was actually about 50 before we amended it with cultural and social traits, but it ends up being 80 questions that if we went to somebody or an organization, we could actually say to them, here, answer these questions and we'll tell you about your psychology, and we'll be able to tell you what you will do under certain circumstances. That's all very well. We can also do a different approach. We can go to some long texts that somebody has written, and we can do a content analysis on those texts, and we can find out that from that statistical evaluation, there are certain words that are predominant. And from that predominance, we can tell what the psychology, what the mindset is of that individual. Okay, that's straightforward. We haven't yet come to the next big jump. And this big jump is really quite major. And it is that people have identities. These identities are of three types. They have personal, private, they have private, personal, and public identities. The private is how they really are. The personal, that which defines them, the personal is how they are as a person, and the public is their projection into the world. We can actually differentiate between personal and public, and we can actually measure them. And earlier I said we had mindsets. We can define two types of mindset. We can define agency mindset, and we can define personality mindset. The personality mindset has only got three traits. The agency mindset has got 5 traits. So the 5 traits include cultural and social dimensions. The personal don't include those. So if there's consistency in the personality, if there's consistency in the private, in the personal and public identities of individuals or organizations, then you would expect that the personal and the public identities would be similar. But when we find, if we look very carefully and we find that there are pathologies, in other words, that the personal and the public mindsets are different, then we would expect personality issues. We would expect individuals to be ill in some way. And that's what we found. So this really Here is the multiple identity model, which has a strategic a cognition system, identity cognition system, a strategic identity figurative, and an operative system. And here we have cultural identity and social identity. And it's these two that we're having to relate. And these two connect with operative intelligence, which, I remind you, is really autoporesis. So, what do we do here? Here we can actually define the personality as MAT3T, and here we find the agency MAT5T. And these end up being slightly different in the way they operate. If the individual or the organization is well balanced, the results should be very similar. So, I think this is the penultimate slide. I don't think I'm going to go through this. What's the time? Let me see. I've nearly come to the end of my time. And it's probably better that I take you through the next slide, which is case examples. Now, I did two studies. This was originally together with a PhD student in Italy who actually, fortunately, knew about some statistical methods that were used, modern statistical methods, to be used in content analysis. And we used these. We used the theory that was generated, and we looked for keywords in long tracts that were produced. We used 10 evaluators, some PhD students, some reporters, and some others, in order to compare the contexts and relate them to each other, so that there wasn't, so we could smooth out inconsistencies. And we looked at Donald Trump and we looked at Theresa May. Now, what I produce through the analysis is what I call analytic diagnosis. That is not a clinical diagnosis. All I can say is whether or not there is a pathology in the individual that I am looking at, and how big that pathology is. And then, if I want to interpret that, I really have to go to a clinical psychologist, and I can spread my information out and see if there's agreement. So, let's look at Trump. Trump has a personal mindset of hierarchical popularism, and that mindset, remember, comes out of looking at the traits that have one value or another value, or somewhere in between, that determines what that trait is. And hierarchical populism is led by embeddedness, which is collectivism, effectively, or one form of collectivism. And he has a public mindset of hierarchical individualism, which is individualism as such, extreme individualism, if you want, run by intellectual autonomy. And the two shall never meet. That is a pathology because there is no connection. So if I look further down at the analytic diagnosis, we have analytic diagnosis deduces malevolent pathologies of Trump arising through an inability to maintain stable, I can't see that word because the pictures are in it, through comfortable contexts being approval from others. And we all know that for him, he really needs approval. situations having been, I can't read that, remote instability, instrumentality, and thus non-ongoing potential for recurrent unexpected psychoses. So that is my deduction, which is an analytical deduction. If we then go to what other people have said about Trump, we have the clinical diagnosis, and it does seem to relate. Serious clinical psychopathologies, lack of, I can't read that word again, feelings of inadequacy in his affective personality, and combines with feelings of inferiority, narcissism, functional deficit, psychosis, etc., etc. So there is consistency. I wouldn't have dared say all those things about Donald Trump from my analytical diagnosis, because I would have been bitterly criticized. But I can show my analytical analysis and say, well, it matches. Theresa May, if I look at her mindset, she has hierarchical populism, which is collectivism, and she actually has a combination of mindsets, which is her saving grace. If she just had hierarchical individualism, which she has, on its own, we would expect to see the same performances as we get from Trump. But no, we see her having egalitarian individualism as well. So it's a balancing position. And therefore, while she has issues, she doesn't have the issues that Trump has. So my analytical diagnosis at the bottom has cultural context where personality is stable and she can learn. Trump can't learn. But in contexts where you have the combination fails to hold this change, I can't read that. So anyway, basically, she's a much saner person because of that analytical diagnosis than Trump is. I think that's it, and I'm one minute within my time. Thank you. Shall I stop the share?
Yes, thank you, Maurice. Well, thank you very much. Really interesting theory and developments. And I am going to ask John to facilitate the meeting, if that's okay, John?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thank you, Maurice. That was fascinating. Meta systems. It's quite wonderful. Okay. So I'm throwing it open to the assembled community, and who's got the first question?
Can I ask the first question?
Of course. Go ahead, Salimi.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And the level of information is much higher than the current literature, which is very fascinating. And I could see that you have gone far beyond the current literature in terms of emotional intelligence and trait theories and those things that is related to leadership. I have two questions. One is that through a part you were talking about pathology. Okay, so some traits causing pathologies. Have you thought about linking your work with leadership? And the fact that especially you mentioned the case of Theresa May and Donald Trump, and majority with the media, we see that they are all criticizing Donald Trump and the way that he was acting. And they were saying, and especially I've seen a paper criticizing why our leaders are like this, why our leaders are not performing the way that they're supposed to be. And I could see that with the information that you provided and the models that you generated, it can explain very well what is the problem and why is that the problem. So perhaps with your work, an explanation could be written for that paper, that this is the cause effect of those things. And another thing is that because your work is superior, you have developed your model through layers and layers of different perspectives. There is a center in University of Hull for people analytics, and Dr. Igor Moses is working for psychometric tests, and I think your work with that will be commercialized very well if you ever interested to do that. He's working on that. He has a big database, and he was interested in linking his work with system thinking and system studies, and he was looking for an idea. I said, my area is not related to, but if I see something, I will let you know. And I see that he can easily link it with the data analytics and things that are more mathematical and things that are now you see in the stream in academia, people analytics, data analytics, and these sort of things that can bring your work to the next level, and that will be to me it will be a sort of very, very good thing for our system thinking society to see that this is actually talking about, because we're always being criticized about this is subjective, this is that. But I think there is a great link to use your work and create a psychometric, a much better psychometric test that can predict certain things about their leadership, certain things about the different areas of people's problem, and that's what I thought from your work.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, you're right. It can be applied very easily to leadership. Yes, you can create psychometrics. There's not a problem.
There was a bit that you were talking about pathological problems. What type of pathological problem was that you mentioned? Is it autopoietic pathology or?
Yeah, well, I wrote a paper that was published by Systems this year called Metacybernetics.
Okay.
And I'm just finishing off a follow-up to that paper. And these discuss autopoiesis in terms of, well, really operative intelligence in Piaget terms. Autopoiesis in terms of networks of processes that belong to sub-agents, each sub-agent composed of agents who are members of the agency, who interact and through their processes produce something. So self-production isn't just a magical thing. It's not just emergent. Well, it is emergent, but it actually takes work to emerge.
Yeah.
Now, if you apply it to organizations, you have one department, you manufacture a car, you have one department manufacturing a door, another one manufacturing a window, another one manufacturing an engine. All of these parts are individual sub-agency processes, part of autopoiesis, that have to come together in the system and either be assembled in the system or in the behavioral dimension of the system to produce the car. So autopoiesis is not some magical thing that everyone seems to talk about in the literature. It's actually a practical thing.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And there are two, in my view, the paper I've just written, which isn't yet published, there are two types of autopoiesis. Remember that autopoiesis really means self-production. And everyone thinks, well, if you go to Forster's work, everyone thinks, well, self-production is all about producing the elements of itself. So you can produce flowers with a particular type of petal or color. That's Eigen Behavior. Okay. Or if you want, Eigen Behavior is the structure of the organization that facilitates behavior. Now, it goes the other way as well. So I call that sort of self-production the production which occurs from the metasystem to the system, and that is a posterior autopoiesis. But when you're observing the context, now the context is the interaction between the subject and the object and other subjects. So I call all of that mess the context. So when you're observing the context, that then is autopoietically brought into the cognitive dimension as what I call the ideate, an image that is either an information image or is integrated into the agency as part of its structure. The difference between them being the difference between, internalization has two dimensions. It has assimilation, which is bringing the information in as a model, and it has accommodation, which brings that model into the structure.
Correct, yeah.
In anticipation, according to Daniel Dubois, there's the equivalent, because this is posterior autopoiesis, or a return operative intelligence. And in this case, we have the ideate being observed by autopoiesis and then producing Eigen behaviors if it is stable. Okay, so there are two ways. And maybe I got it wrong. And anterior, which goes from the system to the metasystem, and there's posterior, which goes from the other way, metasystem to the system. Yeah. Okay, let's see if I get it right. So both of those function. Now, we have to go back to von Forster, who we all celebrate as being able to define the fact that agencies or systems, living systems, are stable, or we can say that they have eigenvalues, and then Forster magically says if they've got eigenvalues, then they've got eigen behavior. No, that doesn't actually work. If they've got eigenvalues, then you need posterior autopoiesis to ensure, if that is stable, that you have eigen behavior, which is some sort of structure that enables behavioral potential to work. Anyway.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't want to go anymore because it still gets more difficult.
Thank you.
Okay, Hugh, you got a question?
Javier.
Yes. My first question is, in your definition of the agents, I see you like in between viable systems and complex adaptive systems. Okay, yeah. Because when you speak of populations of agents within an agent, you are more in the definition of a complex adaptive system.
Yeah, that's right.
And as followers of Stafford Beer, I think that within the realm of complex adaptive systems, you have a very special case where you have a lot of structure based on identity, which is the viable system. And it is perturbing that people like Snowden, for instance, will talk about complex adaptive systems when they're really talking about viable systems.
Yeah.
And if we don't make the distinction, then all that we have been doing is for nothing. Okay. So I would like to know from you whether you're more on the viable system or on the complex adaptive system.
Well, I speak about viability a lot. I'm more, agency theory. The agency theory I use actually originates from psychology. rather than complex adaptive systems. But it's the same thing. They're all relatable, and viability and requisite variety are essential concepts within the theory that I use. So it's a synergy. For me, Stafford Beer's work was of extreme importance. I grew up on Stafford Beer.
And the other comment, it's just a comment. It seems to me that when you analyze Donald Trump, you are quoting as his attributes what his enemies about him.
Yeah.
But you're not considering the way his family or his children talk about him as being a very gentle guy, caring, and whatever.
Yeah.
So you know, we are here in trying to solve for very complex systems, and I have to say at this point, not something that is directly related to what you said, but as some of my friends, some of you know, I fought against electoral fraud in Mexico during more than 20 years. I've been fighting against it all the time, actually, since the 80s or 70s, that is. And there are many similarities between what happened in the United States and what happened in Mexico in 1988. Okay? So Trump can be a villain or he can be a hero, depending on how you look at him. You know, I look at him from a very different perspective. I see him as a victim of a campaign that lasted 4 years, attacking him all the time. Whatever he did, he was crazy, he was this, he was that. And in the end, there was this colossal electoral fraud against him. And I'm including here in my comments a video that I did where I point to all the similarities between the 1988 elections in Mexico and the 2020 elections in the United States. And the analogies are staggering, okay? And the thing is that electoral fraud at that scale always has footprints, and the footprints are all over the place, okay? So I don't want to get in more trouble with all of my friends here, but I'm just saying that there are always two ways to look at things, okay? And we have to explore both.
Yeah. If I may respond.
And people who just shut down and say, there's no proof of fraud. Well, if you can't tell me your adversary's arguments, if you cannot list them yourself, you are not going to be able to refute them, okay? So that is something that I just wanted to say, okay?
In response to your comment about Trump being a nice person, he's a collectivist. His personal identity is collectivism. For people he's around, people he knows, he must be a fantastic person. But when you look at the pathology that occurs, you know, it wasn't my invention that such pathologies occur. It's a lot of work in psychology where people from one culture move in, for instance, to the States, and they try and pretend that their personal identity is different from that which it is, and they project a different personality. Okay. And that leads them to terrible, terrible pathologies, mental pathologies that are sometimes very deep and problematic for them. And this is exactly what Donald Trump has. I'm not commenting whether he's a nice person or a bad person. All I'm doing is identifying that he has a pathology, and I pulled up those criticisms primarily because they reflect those pathologies. They may be from his enemies, but I only had one slide to describe them in. I could have gone much further and said from his personal from his personal identity, he has all these nice features. And for those people who are close to him, he does this, that, or the other. But also his niece is one of his major criticism, produces one of his major criticisms about him. And I've also cited her in the criticism of his personality, in any case.
Okay, Hugh, your turn.
Thank you. Can you hear me this time?
Yeah,
Yes,
we got
yes,
you.
Yes.
Hooray! Okay. Yeah. Maurice, I haven't read your work before, so but it's appealing, and I think it's probably got large overlaps with what I've looked at and I'm interested in too. I'll try and make a few simple points, or things that you might be able to help me with. So my impressions, you have at the core of your work is a lot of deeply systemic interactions. So you're going into meta relations. And then you're switching over to talking about traits.
Yes.
So that's one question for me, is how do you relate your systemic interactions to your traits? Okay. And then my second question is, what's the difference between your dimensions of collective and individual, please?
You have to look at the definitions in the written material.
Okay.
And I have, if you don't want to look at the book, which I think costs, I saw it, they originally said it was $173. And then I saw it on sale for $145, still out of bounds. But if you look on the ResearchGate website project that I have in my email, well, you can find my email easily from the web. I've forgotten where I was going. Okay. Yes. Oh, yeah. That's got all the original material in the website. But in writing the book, because they've been written over about 12, 13 years, as my writings changed, so there are a little few inconsistencies, and those inconsistencies were ironed out in the book. And my recommendation is that you go to your library and ask them to get you a copy for you to look at. And that's the simplest way. You asked me about the systemic nature and how the traits come in. Yes?
Yes,
okay.
Please. Yeah.
Okay. We've got here a multiple hierarchic system, two levels of hierarchy. The metasystem is the regulator of the system, and the combination of the metasystem and the system is regulated by the meta-metasystem. In real terms, that in terms of organization, you could say the system, the strategic system, and the cognitive system or the knowledge system, because knowledge controls the relationship between strategy and action or the system. Okay. Now, these are connected through autoporesis or intelligence, causal agent intelligence. So that these intelligences are then how the systems communicate with each other. They're not somewhere in some mystical universe, unconnected or mystically connected. They're connected through groups of actors or subagents that actually work together to do something to produce a consequence, an effect. And that effect may be to produce a car from a door, from an engine. If you've got the image, a plan for a car, you can a group of people might produce a door, a group of people might produce an engine, a chassis. Well, chassis don't exist anymore, I know. And through autopoietic processes, you end up in the system, the designing a car and then producing it in the real world. So those are the processes that go on, and they're all connected. Now, if you go to psychology, we need trait theory. Each of the different components of the agency has a different type of trait, and that derives, those types of trait derive from the work that Shalom Schwartz produced. And he did a 60,000 respondent evaluation of, he originally produced I think it was 54 questions that people responded to, and he analyzed them, and is probably the foremost work on values that's been undertaken anywhere in the world. And we use that in order to differentiate between the traits. So these traits have an empirical basis based on Shalom Schwartz's work. And they define the nature of each of those systems. So there are, if you combine them using something equivalent to Maruyama's work into mindsets, where the different traits combine together, then you can find that each mindset is indicative of a particular individual. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it certainly, or it takes it takes the question a step or two further, at least, and the answer a step or two further. But so I heard you say basically that the traits map onto components that are part of your modeling of agency.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have more questions, but we'll see if other people have got things, perhaps. Thank you.
Can't hear you.
I was going to wait for someone else to come in. I think Elena's hand's raised next.
Elena, have you anything?
Yeah.
Long time no see. Many years.
I was waiting to be called on. Anyway, my question has to do with whether or not this analysis can be extended to countries.
Yes.
I'm looking at the both the US and Britain as essentially having identities right now that are somewhat shy of coherent and somewhat shy of, I think, the level of shared identity that is necessary to make good progress against a number of challenges like climate change. And I wondered if you thought that the civil wars in Britain between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads and the US Civil War between the North and the South are still reverberating, or whether you think that it is
oh, I love that.
that, you know, these are not connected, and that the levels of polarization and appreciation are more recent origin.
I would suspect that they are related. You know, the Tory party, the Conservatives, are individualists, and they do things that enhances the individual. Only those individuals that take the trouble or have the advantages that enable them to become successful, whatever that means. Whereas the Socialists, the Labour Party, are supposed to at least serve collectivism and assist those people who are less able in order to develop as they can, knowing that viability is always improved when you have more opportunities by more people to contribute to the system. So I think you're right. I think there is a history, and I don't think it's changed. Maybe you could say the same about the states. Maybe the Republicans and the Democrats might have their history that goes back similarly. And it can be expressed in terms of individualism and collectivism, noting that there are, from the theory that I've developed with Gerhard, I think, 4 types of each. That just because somebody has a social conscience doesn't mean that they're not an individualist. And vice versa. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions?
I have a short question, okay, Czesław?
Okay, yes.
First of all, English is not my native language. No, that's the first point. Secondly, I have a double background in physics and in social science. So when seeing such elaborate schemes, I have some linguistic, hermeneutic problems, whether, for instance, you make some very strong, it's somehow concealed that you are making very strong, let's say, some assumptions that, for instance, you know what knowledge means. For instance, and when we look at, when we study the common knowledge, so and developing mathematical models of this, so there are the quarrels between whether it is the just common knowledge or common belief. And that's my point is, of course, I'm from outside the Anglo-Saxon linguistic sphere, but nonetheless, even if you wanted to communicate your ideas to people who are not so deeply familiar with systems thinking, but understanding, the meaning of those terms, it will be quite difficult to comprehend it. So for me, it's the point of effectiveness of communication. That such boxes, linked with the arrows, and that this is the model. So then we come to linguistics. Is this metaphor? Is it the model? If it's the model, what is the accuracy? To what extent is it an analogy or so? So I know your writings, so I know I can expect your answer, but nonetheless, I'm sharing with you my doubts because it's very practical for me because I'm working on some things where this is coming from, not as somebody from Poland, but just doing with more precise definitions, not absolutely precise. I know Wittgenstein, by the way, was a soldier in Krakow for some time, so I'm always joking. Let me stop that.
Thank you for that. I'm very appreciative of people from other countries speaking English so well as you. Let me admit that my father was Russian and my mother was German and my wife is Spanish. So and I speak Spanish and German. Unfortunately, I don't speak Russian, but so I have some feeling for what you're saying. In my presentation, I haven't talked except for one illustration about knowledge. So I've escaped that one. In other writings that you will have read, I have talked about knowledge and I haven't discussed what we mean by knowledge, but let's leave that aside because my current writings, I sidestep that all the time. And instead I talk about behavior, structure, and regulation. And those are the three attributes that are central to my theory. And those three are connected with some sort of intelligence. And those intelligences are causal agent intelligences. So that's in a nutshell, that's the theory. So if I now want to talk about meta-systems or meta-meta-systems or meta-meta-meta, etc. All I have to do is define my causal agent and then demonstrate that it's valid to define it and that it actually has work to do. In most cases, it won't, because I've played around with fourth order, and I've even played around with fifth order cybernetics. And my conclusions are, you've really got to have a new paradigm if you want to make them sustainable. Does that answer your question?
Okay, but just my brief comment. I haven't checked it, because what I could elaborate more on that. In the information society, we are now falling the victims of the infinite regress. I could elaborate more on that. I know that I know and so on. I'm ignorant that I'm ignorant and so on. So I could talk much more about this. And once, I don't know, it's my sheer ignorance right now. Once I came across a remark saying that Aristotle said that the third level or fourth level of regression of self-reflexivity is useless. I don't know this. Of course, we could use some models and so on. It's just a hint, I'm working on this because what is needed for me is the levels of knowledge and then the levels of common knowledge. That's the point, when we communicate. So,
well,
at the moment, you have to cut it,
As part of my work in the past, I've differentiated between Piaget, who was talking about a personal knowledge, and well, I've forgotten his name, talks about social knowledge, anyway. And the two are related, and I can always generate a model that connects those models. In fact, I have in the past connected those sorts of knowledge.
Okay, sorry, I stopped with them.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Len, you saw your hand up. Is another question, or are you? Okay, right. Well, if no other questions, we go back to Hugh, who I'm sure has several.
Thank you. It's good timing. I've just finished my tea. Yeah. Okay. Can we please go back to the interactions between cognition and affect in the model? Because one of the things I find that theorizers often overlook is the changing relationship between cognition and affect, particularly in a developmental context. So to give an example, children are often not able to regulate their emotions particularly well, but this is something that they can learn to do as they grow older. Okay, so we can look at change in relationships there. Is this something you're taking into account?
Yes.
And that the traits take into account?
Yes, they do. Their inability to regulate their emotions is part of their intelligences, affective or autoporesis, and that can be easily represented. You can model that very easily for children or for adults. It may be that autopoiesis is not very efficacious. It may be that there are pathologies. Maybe they've had developmental problems caused either externally or internally, whatever, that inhibit their expressing their emotions or they're regulating their emotions.
Yeah, I was thinking particularly, well, I mean, development, people in talking about development, psychological development often have preferences for talking about children rather than adults because people don't like to talk about the development of adults, but I'm very happy to. For me, that applies to adult development too. And, I think you can easily make assumptions that based upon large subsets of the population, but you can, I believe you also can have minorities that can attain certain degrees of self-control and self-regulation, in which they're not subject to the normal kinds of statistics. So,
well,
yeah.
you're right. If we look at traits rather than the intelligences, because the traits really inform the way the intelligences work, the traits actually can change because they're value-based. Now, values are long-lasting. In Myers-Briggs theory, they use preferences. They can change like your washing. But in Shalom Schwartz's work, values are long-lasting, but they can change. So adults can develop in the same way that children can develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And what about components in your model that map onto traits? For me, I would expect them to not necessarily be strictly distinct, but one bleed into another. And is that something that you're allowing for?
What do you mean by components?
Well, you described, it's only an inference, you described your traits as mapping on to components within your agency model.
Yeah, you're talking about the sort of yin-yang value that they can take. Those traits are defined by either one value or another, which are paired, opposite pairings, and depending on which value the trait takes, that will determine the nature of the person, that aspect of the personality.
Right. Sorry, I was thinking more along terms of if I have a trait for thinking in particular ways, then I would, the way I would think about it is I wouldn't think of this subset of methods or thinking patterns as being bounded by any fixed boundary, and therefore those, how that is described in terms of traits, for me, I'd have thought, well, that could bleed into other kinds of traits. Do you see? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. When the traits are mutually influential.
Yeah. Okay.
If a trait influences a causal agent like autopoiesis, then it will affect the trait. It could affect the trait in the next. Well, it will affect the trait, the performance, the result, the causal effect that occurs in the next in the system, in the operative system. But they all come together in any case in the mindset.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hugh, is that all your questions?
Yeah. If other people got them.
Well, it's open to everybody else. Anybody else got a few final questions? We got a couple of minutes left to go. Javier.
Thank you, Maurice, for your contribution. I wonder how you work out the fact that Stafford mentioned that the identity was the closure of a viable system. So when you add this meta system, how does it blend with the idea of closure? Is it like inside this other stuff, or
yeah, it's all inside.
External, or because you can represent it externally, as for instance, the management is represented externally to the system for illustration purposes, but actually it is contained in the operation. Okay, so how do you work this out?
All of these. One way of thinking about this is you can reduce it to a system and metasystem, and you can leave it at that. And then you can say, one way of looking at it is to say in the metasystem, there are subdivisions. So any closure that relates to the metasystem also relates to all of the bits that go inside it.
Okay.
I describe that in the Metacybernetics paper that you can find on the web, I think.
So what you're saying is that this is like zeroing into the identity of any system, in the system's identity, like zeroing in. inside of it and knowing much more of what's going in there.
You know, when Stafford, Stafford drills down to get more detail. Well, you can drill down, you could drill out. It's equivalent. So in higher order cybernetics, it's like drilling out. It's really part of the metasystem, and you can conceive of it as being inside the metasystem. But if you want some sort of metaphysical extension that regulates the metasystem, and in principle, but I'm always loath to say that it's possible. In principle, there are an infinite number of higher order metasystem, higher order regulators in the metasystem, or a part of the metasystem that regulates the metasystem. So you can envisage it in many different ways. But yes, it's effectively whatever is relevant to the metasystem is relevant to all of the meta-metasystems, etc.
I also like the fact that you mentioned the yin yang, the opposite value, because as an attorney, the VSM helped me discover that our value system in a juridical system has all these counterbalancing values. Okay, so let's for instance, if you are centered on justice, then you have security in the law as an opposite, okay? And depending on whether you favor justice or you favor security, a case will be resolved totally differently, and it'll still be legal, okay? So yes. This is how the law is adapting. It has mechanisms to adapt to situations by emphasizing one value over another. And right now I see in the United States this enormous shift between individualism and collectivism. And I understand it, but if you're dealing with the identity of the country per se, you better watch out. You don't know what you're going to get. So I would say caution, okay?
Yeah, I agree with you. And the theory of the traits is totally built on yin-yang principles. And balance.
Yes, I can see, and that's what it makes it so useful, I guess.
There, in the book, I think that's just come out on chapter 14, is mathematical theory that discusses a bit of this yin-yang stuff. It's using Roy Frieden's EPI theory, extreme physical information, which is built on Fisher information, which works very well with the theories that I've developed.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. If there's no more final questions, we draw it to a close, and thank Maurice very, very much for fascinating talk and a fascinating debate.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. And
nice to see you all, and nice to see those I haven't seen for so long.
Well, indeed.
Bye.
We're back in 2 weeks with
next time Enrique Rivera from Chile.
Rivera from Chile, who is the guy who put together a big exhibition about cybersyn in Chile, and has done some really fascinating work since then. So should very, very practical application. Very different from tonight's.
Well, he's going to be talking about the relationship between Maturana and Stafford and the influence that they have had in the new Chilean constitution.
So fascinating stuff. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
John, Angela, I've got a request. I've got a request, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one of the videos you put up on YouTube, it might be the last one, but there's that I didn't get to attend, so I wanted to watch them on YouTube. But the recording was just of the talker and not of his slides. So if you could post the slides somewhere, that would be handy, please.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Right. No, I think that we may be able to find the recording with the videos.
Yeah, that'd be good.
That is just a mistake when because Peter Tuteman is the one that is helping us to create the YouTubes. So I talked to Peter.
Right. That'd be great. Thanks. Yeah.
If not, we'll put the slides.
If not, we'll put the slides, or in any case, we'll put the slides.
Oh, that's the more general question. Are slides generally available that people are presenting on, or is that?
I mean, it's just that not always we remember to ask the speakers to leave them with us. But Maurice did leave the slides, didn't you? You sent them to me.
I sent you them already.
So I will apply the slides from Maurice. So
lovely. Would that be somewhere on Metaforum? Will it?
In general, I have the slides. So if you want the slides from any of the previous ones, just ask me.
Lovely. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.